Good morning, Rabbi. We are continuing on Masechet Berachot, and we are holding by the Mishnah, the bottom of Chaf Bet Amud 22b, and we finished a long sugya of whether or not the person needs to go to mikveh, to Vilat Ezra, the whole Gemara in Baba Kama, Daf Pei Bet, of if a person that had tum'ah coming out of him has to first go to mikveh before he davens, before he learns. And we mentioned at the end that the minhag basically has become like Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera, that they were mebatel this, and we saw how the Rambam wrote that also this has been basically nullified. The Shulchan Aruch in Siman Peichet mentioned the same thing, and we promised we're going to read a piece from Reb Chaim Kanievsky in Berachot Yosher that we have actually started in the afternoons by Mincha to read some of his work in Sefer Berachot Yosher. In Erech Tahara, he writes some very powerful words. He writes that even though that the Rambam, he brings the Rambam that we mentioned, even though that the Rambam basically says it's not a necessity, Shulchan Aruch nifsaka Rambam and Shulchan Aruch paskins like the Rambam, mikol makom katvu achronim. At the end of the day, the Mishnah Berurah, others, Kaf HaChaim, they write that hanoheg litzbol tavala bracha, someone that does is careful and does go to mikveh, tavala bracha, he will be blessed. And they bring in the name of Rambam himself. Actually, Rambam writes in Perek Dalet of Hilchot Tefillah. What we read yesterday was Perek Dalet of Hilchot Kriyat Shema, halacha chet, the last halacha in Hilchot Kriyat Shema. But Rambam himself writes in Hilchot Tefillah, in Perek Dalet, minhag pashut b'shinar, says all the area of Bavel, Babylonia, of back in the days of Chazal, the minhag has been accepted there. Ubesfarad, and also in Spain, she'ein bal. We all know the Rambam was from Spanish Inquisition, not Spanish Inquisition. That's Maran Shkaruch. Maran Shkaruch was 4 years old when the Inquisition happened. He actually was from the people who came with the Gola of the Spanish Inquisition. But Rambam also was from Spain prior to his exile to Eretz Yisrael and then eventually to Egypt. So he says the minhag of the Spanish Jewry and also the Shinar, the areas of Middle East, has been accepted. That a Baal Keri does not daven until he washes up, basically, and he goes to mikveh. And the Shut min Hashamayim, She'elot u'Tshuvot min Hashamayim, is from Rabbeinu Yaakov Mimarvish, one of the Rishonim, one of the medieval authorities, was known as a personality that was so close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu that he would ask questions going to sleep, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu would give him very clear answers. This is a whole, of course, can of worms in the halachic aspects of whether or not a person could rely on something that they tell him in dream, because, as we mentioned before, the story of Rabbi Eliezer Ben Chorkarus, Rabbi Eliezer Agadol, and his machloket with Rabbi Yeshua and his other peers of whether or not the tum'ah that was given to a tanur achnai, the tanur that became tameh, a oven that was made out of clay and became tameh, whether or not you could fix it by slicing it to rings and then afterwards reconstructing it back together. And we mentioned that there was a bat kol that came, and Rabbi Yeshua said, you don't listen to bat kol because lo b'shamayim, he is not in heavens. The Torah has to be very much grounded, and it has to be decided by the betin, by the chachamim. So how in the world can you listen to this? This Rishon wrote a whole sefer called She'elot u'Tshuvot min Hashamayim, questions and answers from heaven. You know, that whether or not you can rely on that and how you can rely on it. You know, Maran Chida puts emphasis on the sefer that is reliable and so on. That's by itself a question that needs to be a very interesting question that needs to be answered. But in Shut min Hashamayim, he actually asked, one of the questions that he asked was about Tevilat Ezra. He asks, Im yesh lahakel b'tfilat Ezra litfilah. Can we be lenient and not go to mikveh when a person is carry and daven without tevilah? And they answered him from Shamayim, Ve'avatem et Hashem Elokechem, that you should serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Heveh Omer Zu Tefillah. The avodah, the service that we have for HaKadosh Baruch Hu nowadays that we don't have the Beit HaMikdash is Tefillah. As we mentioned before, the Gemara really says this in the beginning of Masechet Ta'anit. In the beginning of Masechet Ta'anit, someone is downstairs. And the Gemara there in Daf Bet says, that you should serve Hashem with all of your heart. Zu Tefillah. It's talking about the avodah of Tefillah, that now that we don't have the Korban, we don't have the Beit HaMikdash, we serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu with our prayers. And says, the answer from Shamayim, if this is equivalent of bringing Korbanot, the Tefillah that we do is equivalent of the Beit HaMikdash and the Korbanot, the sacrifices, the offerings that we have. Can you bring an offering when you're Tameh, Chas v'Shalom, to go bring a Korban when you're Tameh? And it says, if they completed the answer saying that even if you want to say that other tum'ot, other impurities nowadays we don't have, it says it's different. Tum'ah me'ones letum'ah mida'at. It's very, very much different. This is the tum'ah hayotze migufo, and therefore, basically, they said you have to go to mikveh. Now, even though that Shulchan Aruch doesn't pass like that, Reb Chaim Kanievsky is bringing why is it so important to be able to do it still, even though that's not an obligation. Now, Maran Shulchan Aruch had a malach that learned with him every day, and everything that he put, he taught him, he put into writing, and we have a sefer called Magid Mesharim from all of the teachings of this malach to Maran Shulchan Aruch. In Magid Mesharim, Maran Bet Yosef writes in Parashat Behar, that the malach told him, Amar lo HaMagid, al tebatel tamid tfilat Baal Keri. Says, never nullify the tefillah of Baal Keri. If you're a Baal Keri, go to tefillah before learning, before davening. You have no idea how important this is. The malach tells the Maran of Shulchan Aruch. Ad kan leshono, and Ariya Kadosh writes in Sha'ar Ruach HaKodesh, in Kitvei Arizal, en davar yoter mukhrach v'sarich el ha'adam b'inyan ha'asaga. If you want to have high-reaching, like your kedusha antennas, your holiness, there's nothing that benefits it. There's nothing like that makes you tahor, and you become a receiver that is pure, and you could actually achieve high levels of kedusha. And the Rishit Chochmah also writes this same thing. He brings a whole long list of important names in the Jewish literature that all of them have emphasized this, and he ends with something that to me is a high. V'ra'iti b'sefer ehad. He says, I saw once in a sefer, and Reb Chaim says, I don't remember which one it is. This is not common that Reb Chaim would say that. He says, Shekol hachiburim shenitkabalu b'chol Yisrael, all of the Sfarim that were written, that were accepted in Klal Yisrael. Many people write a sefer, and nobody even knows about it 50 years later. But all of those that became something, people accepted it, and it became part of the Jewish literature, all of those are from people, that the Mechaber, the author, was careful in Tevilat Ezra. As I said, I saw somewhere, and I don't remember where it is. So that's as far as the Tevilat Ezra goes.
Wait, Rabbi, can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay, I have two questions. What do we do about Shema al Hamitah if you're Baal Keri? And what do you think about the swimming pool? Shema al Hamitah. The last one. Should you just skip it?
Kriyat Shema al Hamitah. No. Again, halachically speaking, Maran writes in Siman Pechet that we don't hold of that. You just have to be, of course, clean. That means that, as we're going to see later on, they cannot be Shechvat Zera on a person, and then you have to do Netilat Yadayim as well. So that's the basic halacha. But for Tvilah, of course, nowadays we're not Machmir in that way. But if someone wants to be Machmir, so then Erachinami, you would be a little bit more careful about that. But Rambam seems to say that the minhag that was accepted was more for Tfilah, not necessarily just for Kriyat Shema and learning. Even though the Takanat Ezra was inclusive of those as well, but the minhag was for tefillah at the very least. Okay. Now we are starting the Mishnah. On the bottom of Chaf Bet Amud Bet says the Mishnah, Haya Omed, this is a packed sugya, very important and very relevant. Haya Omed b'tefillah v'nizkar shu bal kiri. Now, what do you do if you're in the middle of smack in the middle of davening and say, gee, I just remembered that I'm a bal kiri. Lo yafsik. You should not stop your tefillah, ela yekatzer. You should make the tefillah short, as we're going to see what it means. Litvol, yarad litvol. If you went down to mikveh, and down there in the water, then you realize im yachol la'alot, it's early morning, and you have to say Shema, and the time of Shema is quickly, coming up. If you could come up, im yachol la'alot ulit kasot velikrot at shelo te'eh netzach hamam. If you have enough time to come out of the water and cover yourself and say Shema before Netzach Hama, Ya'aleh v'yitkaseh. You should quickly come out, dry yourself, cover yourself, and say Shema on time, because the Zman of Shema would be, here the Mishnah is assuming, the Zman of Shema is by Netzach Hama. Anything after Netzach Hama seems to be a b'di'evet. So therefore, you want to catch the Zman of Shema, and you have to make this calculation. I'm in the water. I see, maybe it was in the river, and you see in the horizon, the sun is rising, it's coming, it's about to come out. So if you have time to quickly jump out and dry yourself and get dressed and say Shema, do it. And if you don't have time, if you don't have time, you cover yourself with the water and you're going to read Shema. You should not cover yourself with dirty water or b'mea mishre. Waters, different sort of dirty waters, which we're going to discuss. Until you pour some clean water inside of them, and then it becomes mutar. And how much do you have to distance yourself from them, which we're going to see what them means, and also from so'ah, from excrement, before you are allowed to read Shema and daven dalet amot. 4 amot, 6 feet, you have to distance yourself from them before you're allowed to say Shema, before you're allowed to daven. Okay, this Mishnah actually becomes a source of a lot of very interesting halachot. For instance, just a teaser, I'll mention it, and then Bezat Hashem will circle back to this. Rabbi Yashiv was asked, and this is printed in the tshuvot that they put together from his writings, Kovetz Tshuvot, in Chelek Aleph Siman, I believe it's Siman Tetvav. He writes, he was asked, what do you do if you are a nets guy, so to speak? You always daven with nets. And now, one day you're going to out of town, and the only minyan that they have is some Chabad that they daven one minyan, and that's it, basically. You don't have like multiple minyanim, so you have a choice. You could daven Netzach Hama b'yachid, or you could daven after Netzach Hama b'tzibur. Which one is more important? Do you daven b'tzibur? Do you daven? He actually brings the raya from this Mishnah over here, that the ikar of the nets is to say Shema with nets, and therefore says Rabbi Yashiv, you have no problem. Get up early in the morning, say your Shema right before nets with the Netzach Hama, and then afterwards you could daven with tzibur later on, and don't daven b'yachid. But that really becomes clear from this Mishnah over here that we just learned. So let's start the Gemara. The Gemara says, Tanu Rabbanan, Haya omed b'tfilah v'nizkar shehu ba'al kevi. So if you could, if you have time, lo yafsik, you should not stop your tfilah if you remember that you're a ba'al kevi, ela yekatzer. You should just make your tfilah a abridged version of tfilah. Do it quick. Haya koreh b'Torah. If you're reading from the Torah and you remember your Balkari, Eino mafsik ve'oleh. You don't stop and just remove yourself. Ela megamgem ve'koreh. You do it very quick. Rabbi Meir argues, says, no, you can't just go on and finish the entire Kriya. En Baal Keri rashai likrot b'Torah yoter migimel psukim. A Baal Keri is not mutar to read more than 3 psukim. So it's essentially what he's saying, Rabbi Meir, is, the minimum of Kriya that you have to have is 3 psukim. So if you remember, so it depends. If you have done 3 psukim already, just stop. And if you haven't, finish up 3 psukim, and then you basically have to go sit down. And you can't continue. So this machloket, Rabbi Meir and Tarakam. Tanya Idach, a different Braita says like this. If you're standing in the middle of Tfilah Shemona Esrei, and all of a sudden you notice that there is so'ah, there is excrement in front of you. So what do? Of course, you can't daven in the vicinity of so'ah. Therefore, the Braita says, "Mehalech lefanav ad she'izraken ala achorav." You go ahead until it is in the back of yours by 4 amot.
Passes in front of it.
Yep, you basically stop the davening and you walk until the tzoah is behind you at least 4 amot, and then you could daven. Again, because it says ve'aya machanecha kadosh. Machanecha kadosh, your machane, your immediate surrounding, can't be with so'ah and with dirty things, with dirtiness, and excrement is considered something disrespectful. So therefore, can't be within your machane, within your domain. Your domain is 6 feet around you, 4 amot around you. So therefore, you go, and this is a case that, of course, the smell is not there. If you go 4 amot and still smell it, of course, that's still asur. So there are 2 different elements over here, which we're going to again discuss more. But the actual machane has to be kosher. Even if there's no smell whatsoever, you have to still be 6 feet past it. Now, this actually becomes you say, well, Baruch Hashem, nowadays we don't have this type of situations unless you live in in areas that they have the homeless thing and without shelters. You may come to actually encounter these types of things. Normally, but in a daily life, you could encounter this with garbage too. But usually you're not standing. But your baby comes. You're standing to daven, and your baby with their dirty diaper, right? You don't have to go to Tzoah. Tzoah could come to you, right? so you have to be mindful of the walking Tzoah that if it's considered covered, it's not covered, but certainly the element of tzoah, when it has bad smell, it's something that's very much relevant. And we're going to discuss this a little bit more with its details as well.
What do we do in that case?
Well, you have to stop and
keep moving?
Not keep moving necessarily, but if you have to stop to get somebody to get the baby out and so on, that's what you're going to be doing. So says the Gemara. So you basically just said in this Braita that if you find so'ah, if you notice this so'ah in front of you, you basically just go ahead until it's found behind you further than 4 amot. And the Gemara asks the question, but we learned in a different Braita that you go sideways, not that you go ahead, you go sideways. Says the Gemara, look, Asha, it's not a question. It depends if it's possible. If you're standing by the river, so you can't go inside the river, so you got to go sideways. Standing by a wall, you can't go past the wall, so you go sideways. But if you could go ahead, you go ahead. So this way, the tzoah is better that the tzoah should be behind you than to be in the side. But if it's not possible, so then you go to the side. If you were davening and you found so'ah in the place that you were davening, Amar Rabba. In other words, you did Shemona Esrei, and then you say, Oseh Shalom Yivromav, Ubrahamav Yaseh Shalom Aleinu, Balkul Israel, and you take a look on your side as you're turning around, and you see there is so'ah there. So I daven the whole Shemona Esrei. Was that a proper tefillah, or should I daven again? And again, this becomes a serious halachic question as well, depending on whether or not the area that you davened, you had to assume that there may be so'ah. If you had to assume that there may be so'ah there, then you have to check. And again, talking about a home with babies, or someone that asked this question and his wife was running a daycare. So if your wife is running a daycare in your living room, then you must assume that there may be a dirty diaper somewhere around, and they haven't gotten the chance to put in the diaper pail, and therefore you have to check the area. If you didn't check the area, and after you davened, it happened to actually be a dirty diaper there, so then you perhaps are at fault. Whereas if you were not supposed to actually think that there is a diaper because you don't have babies, and then after tefillah comes out that your wife was hosting a friend and you didn't know about it, and one thing led to another, and there was a dirty diaper. So that's already, of course, a different story, because you were not expected necessarily to check into that reality. The reality of your home always is a clean home. There's no babies, there's no diaper, and so on. So that makes the difference. So in a regular case, if you davened and afterwards you noticed so'ah in the vicinity of your tefillah, Amar Rabba says, Afal pi shechatat tfilatot tefillah. Even though that you sinned, you should have checked, and you didn't. Tefilatot tefillah. Still, your tefillah is accepted as a proper tefillah. Matkifla Rava asks Rabba, V'ha zevach reshayim to'eva. This guy is, in his own level, is a rasha. He went against the halacha. He should have checked, didn't check. And he davened against the halacha. And he happened to be actually tzoah there. So he messed up, basically. And zevach reshayim to'eva, if you bring a zevach, if you bring a korban to Hashem, while being a wicked man, while doing something wrong, that zevach, even though that you're bringing a korban, that korban is to'eva, is abomination. It's not wanted by Hashem. And Rava disagrees with Rabbi in that assertion, and he says, O'il v'chata, because he sinned, because he should have been careful more and checked to make sure that the area that he's going to be davening to Hashem is a clean area, and he didn't. Even though that he davened, his tefillah is to'eva, he has to daven again. Tanu Rabbanon. We learned, how about if you have a reality, people have, we have to ask your local gastroenterologist, but?
Is Rabbi assuming that the place was a place that there was going to be excrement there?
So this becomes somewhat of a machloket of Rishonim. What exactly? I was afraid you were going to say.
Because what abomination? You showed up at a place that is not supposed to be a place that there is. What fault of
So the Gemara does not discuss that, as you can see, but Talmidei Rabbeinu Yonah and other Rishonim, and it trickles down into the Poskim and Shulchan Aruch. They debate whether or not this is in a scenario that how much of expectation can you have already. And what I said as preface to this is really the halacha, that if you were not expected, you were not to expect that there should be any dirtiness, any so'ah there, then you're fine. Even if you end up being something there, you didn't do anything wrong. But in a normal setting of back then, that you could have so'ah in different places, you should have checked, and if you didn't, then it's zevach reshayim, so you were at fault. You should have been more careful, and you weren't, right? So it says, the Gemara, what if, this happens, again, correct me, doctor, if my recollection is about 25 years old, that we learned, there are two different muscles that control urinating, and the stop, one of them is subconscious, one of them is conscious, and depending on what could happen to the body, at some point, the age would be one factor, you could lose control of the subconscious one, and then at some point the person could be not fully in control of their urine, And you could have a reality that the person is standing and, drops of urine could be coming down. Okay, so if you have, or if you have that type of scenario that you have prostate issues, and again, you're in need of catheter, and back then, if you didn't have catheter, so what would happen? It would actually leak, right? So you're standing in tefillah, and you realize that it started leaking now. Now you have to wait for it until it finishes. Now you can't continue davening as your body is subconsciously urinating. So says the Gemara, Posek, and again, this is, to be thankful for being healthy. Not everyone is in control of their bodily functions. And if a person is not, so then Posek, immediately when you realize that this is happening, you stop the davening until it actually finishes. And then you go back to the tefillah. Well, so we have to discuss what happens with the urine, right? So to just say it simply, right? If you have everything observed in the clothing and there's no smell, by urine is different than so'ad and excrement, and you will be allowed. Or if it fell into the ground and it was completely swallowed up in the dirt in a way that it's not tofeach al menat latpiach. It's not something that if you touch it, it makes you wet enough to make something else wet. Again, the details of which we're going to discuss in the sugyas upcoming. But says the Gemara, to where do you go back? When you say choser umitpalel, he goes back and he davens. What do you mean choser umitpalel? I could understand those words of the Gemara in two different ways. I could understand choser umitpalel to mean that you go back to where you stopped. You go back and you daven. In other words, you stop davening, you go back and you daven. Where do you go back? To the place that I stopped. Or I could understand, choser umitpalel, you go back to daven again. In other words, you messed up your tefillah basically, so you have to start over again. Well, once you add it, it could go change as well, right? But which one is it? Is it that you go back to the beginning of tefillah, or is it going back to where you stopped? Now, this becomes the offshoot of, this is strange because the actual sugya is a daf from, it's daf chafbet, chafdalet, a page from now, in regards to Kriyat Shema. But this is the offshoot of that sugya. Says the Gemara, Rav Chisda Rav Hamnuna, Chad Amar Choser leRosh, v'Chad Amar leMakom shePasak. One of them says, there's a good Jewish community, you have all of the bases covered. So one of them says you have to go back to the beginning, and the other one says, sure enough, you have to go back to where you stopped. You don't have to go back to the beginning. Says the Gemara, let us assume that what is the machloket of Rav Hamnuna and Rav Chisda? You know what their core of the machloket is? The core of machloket is the sugya in next page, which is more savar. One of them holds im shaha kedei ligmor et kulah choser lerosh, that if you pause a long enough of a pause that you could finish the whole tefillah, then you have to go back to the beginning. More savar, and the other one holds leMakom shePasak, that even if you paused a long pause, you still go back to the place that you paused. You don't go back to the beginning of the tefillah, which is again the sugya by Kriyat Shema in next page of the Gemara. If you had to pause in the middle of Shema, and let's say the Shema takes you 5 minutes to say, and you pause 5 minutes, you go back to where you stopped, or you go back to the beginning of Shema. Same would be for the tefillah. So says the Gemara, even though that this is a legitimate question, Rav Ashi says, Amar Rav Ashi, Hai im shaha im lo shahami ba'ile. If that was the core of machloket, then Rav Chisda and Rav Hamnuna are disagreeing. They should have said, if you waited, if you didn't wait. They should say. They don't. In our case, he says, if you were davening and you realized urine is coming out, you have to stop, and then afterwards you have to go back to the tefillah, and then there's machlokas, where do you go back to? But there's no mention of the time lapse in between the two parts of tefillah. And that's like ikar chaser min sefer. The main point is missing. So that can't be. The simple wording of the machloket that the Gemara brought from Rav Chisda and Rav Hamnuna indicates clearly that regardless of the time, if you're not talking about the time lapse, and still there's a machloket. So says Rav Ashi, Ela, everybody agrees that if you stopped and paused enough time that it would have taken you to finish the tefillah, then you go back to the beginning of tefillah. That's not an argument. That's agreed upon. So what's the machloket over here? In other words, here we're speaking about a case that you did not pause enough time to finish the entire Shemona Esrei. Your pause was a shorter pause, and yet there is machloket whether or not you have to go back to the beginning of tefillah or you go back to the place that you paused. Says the Gemara, "V'hatam bedelo sha'aka miflegi." There, Rav Hamnuna and Rav Chisda are disagreeing in a case that you did not pause enough to finish the entire tefillah. So why is it that one of them says you have to go back to the beginning of tefillah? The more savar gavra dechuyahu ve'en ra'ui ve'en tefilato tefillah. One of them holds the guy is not a vessel of tefillah, a body that needs to go and urinate and go to bathroom. The body is considered a dirty body. That body, that person is not ra'ui, is not fit for davening, for service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So if you did it, doesn't count. That's what one of them holds. The other one says, no, the guy is fit for tefillah. It's just that he had a technical problem. Technical problem. So you deal with the technical problem. How do you deal with it? You stop when you're urinating, you can't daven. You pause. And if your pause was not long enough to finish the whole tefillah, so you check all the boxes, basically you go back to where you paused. That's the machloket. Now that becomes a whole other sugya, fascinating sugya by itself, which the Gemara is going to discuss right now. Tanu Rabbanan, we learned first white line. If you need to use the bathroom, you should not daven. And if you did daven, tefilato to'eva, your tefillah is an abomination, you have to go back and daven again. Amar Rav Zvid, this is one version of the Braita, right? That it's a very harsh, yes. We're soldiers of an army. If you mess up, there was this, I once gave a shiur on learning 10 lessons in Avodat Hashem from Navy SEALs, right? And it's really fascinating. We should have it at some point, because one of the things that they have to be, they have a uniform, and the uniform they have to clean it, they have to press it. It has to be super sharp. It can't have any flaws. And they have a daily check where they have very short time to get dressed in the morning. And then a guy comes and checks them. And if there is the smallest crease or something that's imperfect, they have something called the sugar cookie effect, where they have to go with the boots and the entire uniform. They have to go into the water. The base is in San Diego, near San Diego here. They have to go into the ocean with their clothing. Then they have to come out, lay on the sand, and roll until the entire body is covered with sand. And then they have to go through the entire day with that. Wet and dirty. Sugar cookie, right? Effect. That's what's known. So sometimes they become sugar cookie. Yeah, you have to be perfect. You're a soldier in the service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There has to be some level of perfection. Right? So it says the Gemara. Amar Rav Zvid, don't become Navy SEALs. Amar Rav Zvid, ve'itema Rav Yehuda. Now here is Amoraim explaining the Braita. They say, Lo shanu, we didn't learn this. This is only talking about a case that you have reached a threshold of no tolerance. that means you can't hold yourself anymore. The need of using bathroom has become so real that you cannot control it anymore. But if you could control yourself, tefillah to tefillah, still your tefillah counts. Still your tefillah counts. Ve'at kama, and how much is considered being able to control yourself? Amarav sheshet, ad parsa. You have to be able to wait the time that takes to walk a parsa, which is 72 minutes. 72 minutes. That means if I need to use the bathroom, and if I would be asked, can you hold it for 72 minutes? I would say, absolutely not. Then, if you daven, that tefillah is abomination. If I could say, yeah, I could. I need a little bit. I need to, but it's not such a big deal. I could hold this for 72 minutes. Then, if you daven, the tefillah is fine. Now, should you daven? It's a different question. We're going to get to it in a second, right? Ika dematni la amatnita. And there are those who have this actually built in, this halakha built into the Braita itself. That the Braita says this little detail of halakha. That the Braita itself continues that if you need, you should not daven. But if you could hold yourself, says the Braita, when is it abomination? When you can't hold yourself. But if you could hold yourself, then your tefillah still counts. And the Braita will continue until when? Until how long? Amar Rav Tzvi ad Parsa. Rav Tzvi would say ad Parsa 70 minutes. Amar Rav Shmuel bar Nachmani. Amar Rabbi Yonatan. Rav Shmuel bar Nachmani says in the name of Rabbi Yonatan, Hanitzrach linkavav, someone that needs to use the bathroom. Hareze lo yitpalel. He should not daven. Mishum shenemar, because the pasuk says, Hikon likrat elokecha Yisrael. Prepare yourself. Hachana. Hikon. Prepare yourself. Likrat elokecha. In anticipation of facing HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in anticipation of encountering the Kedusha of Hashem, standing in front of Hashem, davening, you have to prepare yourself. You have a meeting with the president, even if he wasn't dead, right? This joke doesn't get old, right? You have to prepare yourself. You have to prepare yourself. So when you come to daven, you have to prepare yourself. Says Rav Shmuel bar Nachmani. Therefore, Rabbeinu Yonah, in the back of the Gemara, Rabbeinu Yonah, they write, this is coming to teach you a new halakha. The new halakha is, even though that I just got finished telling you that if you could hold yourself 72 minutes, you could daven, your tefillah is not abomination, and you don't have to go back and daven again. If you ask me, should I daven? The answer is absolutely no. If you need bathroom, you don't daven, and you go to the bathroom. The Mishnah Berurah Paskins, and we're out of time, we'll perhaps continue this a little bit more, that if you need the bathroom, even if you can hold yourself, and if you go to the bathroom, you're going to lose tefillah b'tzibur, says the Mishnah Berurah, go use the bathroom. Don't daven when your body is not clean.
This is number one or two.
Even though that you could control yourself, even though you could control yourself, it still is not considered a guf naki, and therefore it's not the proper tefillah. Even though that the tefillah would count if you would daven, but it's not the proper thing to do. And B'ezrat Hashem, the details of which we're going to discuss in the days to come. That for sure, in that case, for sure, if you could control, then you finish it. If you can't, yes, you stop, you go, you come back.
Depends how much coffee you had in the morning.
Yeah, we have.